I'm not good at starting these videos. I don't know how to hook, the viewer in. So I guess I'll just start. Thanks for joining me yet again for another U.S. history lesson with Mr. Rodriguez. So today's lesson, we're going to be using our My World History book. And we're going to start here on page 171, Washington's Presidency. That's topic 3, lesson 1. You may recall from past lessons that George Washington was a critical figure in the start of the French and Indian War. He was also the commander of the armed forces during the Revolutionary War, and more importantly, he was also the president of the Constitutional Convention when they met in Philadelphia. So when the time came to elect the nation's first president, it wasn't a difficult choice. Most Americans already knew George Washington. They were familiar with him, they trusted him, and they regarded him as a sort of hero, like a demigod, if you will. So when George Washington took office, when he was inaugurated, he felt a tremendous amount of pressure on his shoulders. One witness at the inauguration on April 30th, 1789, remarked that George Washington looked grave, almost to sadness. That is the depth of the sense of responsibility that George Washington had on his shoulders. Washington knew that his main task would be to establish the government, to ensure that it would run and operate smoothly according to the new Constitution. But he also wanted to ensure that this new nation, this new government of, by, and for the people would survive into the centuries, would survive well into the future. So the Constitution is pretty clear in what the requirements are to become president, but the Constitution doesn't really state what the president should do day to day. In other words, how should the president actually govern? Washington was quoted as saying, "There is scarcely any part of my conduct which may not hereafter be drawn into a precedent." In other words, he was very well aware that future presidents would be using his example as a model for how to be president, right? There's always a lot of pressure to be the first one. One of Washington's first acts was to assemble around him a team, which was called a cabinet. See, George Washington was a great leader, but he also understood that he did not know everything and that he would need to surround himself with brilliant men with lots of experience who would be able to advise him and support him in establishing this new government. One of the key figures that Washington selected for his cabinet was Alexander Hamilton. He selected Hamilton to be his first Secretary of the Treasury. Now, Washington and Hamilton had been close throughout the Revolutionary War. Washington was something like a mentor to Hamilton. So Washington knew that he could rely and trust Hamilton. The other person that Washington selected was Thomas Jefferson. He assigned Jefferson to the role of Secretary of State. In other words, Jefferson would be responsible for how the United States engaged with foreign nations. Now, keep in mind, Jefferson was also an important and influential figure in the nation at the time because, as you will recall, Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. And he was also an influential figure in Virginia, where he established the principle of separation of church and state, which was enshrined in the First Amendment. Now, keep in mind that Hamilton and Jefferson were bitter rivals. The two of them did not get along and were often on opposite sides of any issue. One of the issues that Hamilton and Jefferson clashed over was the creation of the National Bank and Hamilton's plan to pay off the federal and state government's war debts, the Revolutionary War debts. Many of the southern states, like Virginia, felt that the plan was unfair since many of those states had already paid off their debts. They also believed that Hamilton's plan would benefit people who were bankers and investors, and that it wouldn't really benefit the average person. But Hamilton was very insistent that in order for our nation to have good credit, in order for our nation to be regarded as an economic player on the global stage, that we needed to be responsible with our money and that we needed to pay off our debts. Another critic of Hamilton's plan was James Madison, who is regarded as the father of the Constitution. But James Madison and other Southern leaders wanted the nation's capital to be in the South. So Alexander Hamilton saw an opportunity to negotiate and to arrive at some compromise. So after a meeting, Hamilton and Madison were able to hammer out a deal where Madison would agree to support Hamilton's debt repayment plan in exchange for agreeing to settle our nation's capital in the South, specifically along the Potomac River between Virginia and the state of Maryland. The capital would not belong to either Virginia or to Maryland, but instead would be part of its own region, if you will, called the District of Columbia. As part of Hamilton's plan to repay the federal and state war debts, they increased taxes on the sale of whiskey and alcohol. Well, they didn't foresee that this would impact small businesses, farmers, and alcohol manufacturers who were quite upset by the tax. In fact, to the extent that they started up a rebellion, which we refer to as the Whiskey Rebellion. Thousands and thousands of these people marched in the street, sometimes tarring and feathering tax collectors. They even compared this tax on alcohol and liquor to the way that the British government would tax them before the Revolutionary War. But unlike during the Shays Rebellion, President Washington quickly used the militia to put an end to the Whiskey Rebellion, thus showing Washington's determination and leadership skills, and showing that this new government under the Constitution would not tolerate violence and would not allow a rebellion to tear it down. One of the other major challenges that George Washington faced as president was the issue of foreign policy. Now, Thomas Jefferson, as you'll recall, was put in place in the cabinet as George Washington's Secretary of State, meaning his job was to represent the United States to other nations around the globe. This became a problem in 1789 when the French Revolution started. The French Revolution was kind of inspired by our own revolution. However, within a couple of years, the French Revolution became quite bloody, and it has been referred to as the Reign of Terror, because part of the French Revolution included the beheading of people who disagreed with the revolutionaries. And by 1793, this new France invaded Austria, to which Britain then responded by declaring war on France. Thomas Jefferson saw an opportunity here for the United States to return the favor to France. After all, under King Louis, we had entered into a treaty with France, and France had helped us in our revolution. However, men like Hamilton, John Adams, and even President Washington himself thought that we just were not able to enter into a war. We were not strong enough to engage in a war overseas, no less. After much deliberations, President Washington decided that we would be neutral, that the United States would not take sides. We would not ally ourselves with France or with England in that war. And Washington ended up sending John Jay, who was one of the co-authors of the Federalist Papers, to negotiate a treaty of neutrality, which did not make the American people very happy, but it nonetheless kept our young nation out of a war in Europe. In 1796, George Washington had reached the end of 2 terms. He set an important precedent by retiring at the end of his 2nd term instead of seeking a 3rd. And that was a precedent that endured for about 150 years until the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was elected 4 times. And after that, they ended up including in the Constitution an amendment that limited presidents to 2 terms. But before he left office, he left behind a farewell address in which he strongly encouraged Americans to avoid any foreign entanglements, to stay out of any permanent alliances in Europe. Especially with our nation being so young and so new, he was really concerned that we would get ourselves involved in a foreign war, a war that could potentially threaten the survival of our democracy, of our republic. And so in his farewell address, he said, "The great rule of conduct for us is to have with them as little political connection as possible." So there you have it. That is the presidency of George Washington in a nutshell. Washington had to establish this new nation. He set many precedents for how presidents should behave. He tried to avoid any foreign entanglements, even with people previously who had been our allies, like the French. And he established a strong economic base, a strong economic system by paying off all of our state and federal war debts. And he also showed that the United States would protect itself using military strength, if need be, against any potential rebellions, such as with the Whiskey Rebellion. And more importantly, we also established that our nation's capital would be located in the District of Columbia along the Potomac River, and that our capital would be named Washington in honor of our first president, George Washington. So there you have it, George Washington, our first and perhaps greatest president. Thank you so much for watching me. I hope you enjoyed this. Be sure to like this video and that you subscribe to this YouTube channel. Go ahead and hit that bell for notifications. All right, guys, that's all I have for you today. Stay in school, be cool, tighten up. Woo, America. All right, peace out. Bye.